All right, we're back in the book of Acts then this afternoon. Wonderful book of Acts. And right now, we're in Acts chapter 22. We're going to be looking at verses 1 through 11 and just the first part of the message. Paul's address to the wild crowd. And it was a wild crowd we saw in the last chapter. Let's review just a bit from last time. And Acts chapter 21 through verse 40 there, the end of the chapter, we looked at that. We saw, first of all, in verses 27 through 32, the riot. And so, many times when Paul went somewhere, he inspired a riot. Well, and a lot of times it was Jewish-inspired riots, and we have the same thing again. We found out in verses 27 and 28 of chapter 2 that it was based on a false accusation. Notice chapter 22, chapter 21 and verse 27. Text says here, when the 7 days were almost over. Okay, so Paul, some Christians very zealous of the law think that you are saying to them, do not obey the law. Do not do anything that conforms to the law. Don't do any of that. Well, Paul wasn't saying that. And they understood that, the leadership in Jerusalem. But what they said is, well, in order to kind of correct that, we have a few fellows here looking to fulfill a vow. We suggest you go with them and pay for them, because they had taken a Nazirite vow. And part of the Nazirite vow was they had to buy some animals, and then they had to sacrifice those animals. Okay, there was a whole process. I'm not going to get into that. But Paul, we suggest you finance it. And it would be a substantial amount of money. So this is going to prove to them Paul is not anti-Jew. Paul is not conforming to some of those things if they want to, voluntarily, right? Paul was not someone that said, you have to do it, because they're not under law, they're under grace, okay? Paul was not an individual who would say, for instance, to the Gentiles, you have to do this. No, but was it allowed if a Jewish person wanted to celebrate? By the way, that happens today. There are Jewish people who are Christians that want to celebrate Hanukkah. Is that sinful? No, I don't know that. In fact, in many ways, their celebration of Hanukkah is a lot more spiritual than our celebration of Christmas is in our culture. I don't have any problem. I can celebrate with them. I have no problem with that at all. In fact, it'd be kind of fun. So there's no problem with that. So Paul is not anti-Jew. He's not anti-Jewish culture. For them, it was part of culture too. He was not don't ever follow the law if you desire to do so. If you desire to celebrate this feast or have this vow to the Lord, and as he was doing here, don't feel like you can't do that. It's all right. Okay? So they suggested, the leadership in Jerusalem, Paul, you need to go with these men. You need to shave your head, do all the things that they were doing, pay for their sacrifices. And it's going to convince people, all the critics, that you are not against this. And so Paul decided to do it. And we find, again, in chapter 21, in verse 27, when the 7 days, this was of this fulfillment of this vow, were almost over, the Jews from Asia, upon seeing him in the temple, begin. So they're expecting it's going to settle things down. It does just the opposite. Began to stir up. By the way, I think it did help with the Christians, because we don't see them objecting. These are pagans. These are people that did not want to accept the message of the gospel. They began to stir up the crowd and laid hands on him. Verse 28, crying out, men of Israel, come to our aid. This is the man who preaches to all men everywhere against our people. He's anti-Jew. And the law, he's anti-law. And this place, he's anti-temple. And besides, he has even brought Greeks. That's a complete lie. Brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this holy place. In other words, he's gone beyond the court of the Gentiles. He's brought a Gentile into the inner part of the temple, and so he has desecrated the temple. Again, a complete lie based on a misunderstanding, and I don't think it may have been a misunderstanding, but I think they were sure willing to go along with it very, very quickly. In verse 28, it says, this is the man who preaches to all men everywhere against our people, against the law, against this place, against the temple. He's brought Greeks into the temple. Again, clearly this was not true. And then notice in verse 29, it was caused by a faulty observation. Notice verse 29, for they had previously seen Trophimus, the Ephesian, a Greek, in the city with him, and they supposed that Paul had brought him into the temple. Why? Okay, I see the two of them together. I bet he brought him into the temple. I mean, it really is a foolish thing to bring together here. It doesn't make any sense. So Trophimus, one of Paul's companions, and you know, Paul had said in Ephesus to the Ephesians, he had said that God had broken down the wall between the Jews and Gentiles. And maybe they're thinking, oh, Paul brings Gentiles right into, that isn't what Paul was saying in that letter. Maybe they were thinking, though, you know, and that message had gotten out. You know, maybe Paul is bringing, you know, Gentiles into the Jewish part of the temple. Well, again, the unbelieving Jews may have even known this guy Trophimus. They were from that area. And for some reason, because of the association between Trophimus and Paul, they automatically jumped to the conclusion that Paul had brought Trophimus, who was a Greek, not a Jew, from the court of the Gentiles and into the actual temple area itself. And this was against Jewish law. It would have defiled the holy place. Paul would never have done this, but they accused him of it. And then we find out in verse 30, it led to a provocation. Verse 30, and all the city was provoked. And the people rushed together, and taking hold of Paul, they dragged him out of the temple, and immediately the doors were shut. So taking hold of Paul, they dragged him out of the temple. Presumably, they dragged him out of one of the inner courts and into the court of the Gentiles. And behind him, they shut the gates or the doors behind him. According to Jewish law, no man's blood could be shed in the inner court. So they want Paul dead. And so they drag him into the court of the Gentiles, where it would be legal to kill him. Verse 31, we find out it resulted in a Roman communication. Well, all of this craziness came to the Antonia fortress, where the Roman army was. Verse 31, while they were, by the way, it was adjacent to the temple. We showed you some diagrams of that several times ago. While they were seeking to kill him, a report came up to the commander of the Roman cohort that all Jerusalem was in confusion. Sir, all Jerusalem's going crazy. Well, what's going on? What's happening? Verse 32, it brought about Paul's salvation or deliverance. At once he took along some soldiers and centurions and ran down to them. We got to find out what's going on. We're supposed to keep peace here. This is crazy. A riot is breaking out. They're going to kill somebody. We need to find out what's going on. And when they saw the commander and the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. So they start beating Paul, intending to kill him. And then when they saw the commander, he's the big guy over there in the Antonia fortress, all right? He's the main guy. They knew who he was. And he's bringing soldiers. They thought, whoa, maybe we're in trouble for causing a ruckus here. And, he's coming to take care of it. So they stopped immediately. And so they stopped beating Paul. So it brought about his deliverance here because of this. And then we see the arrest in verses 33 through 40. We see, first of all, in verses 33 through 36, the Romans attempt to get to the crux of the issue with the Jews. In verse 34, it says, but among the crowd, some were shouting one thing and some another. And when he could not find out the facts because of the uproar. So, here's the commander trying to get to the crux of the problem. He can't. Because he's this. They're shouting one thing and another. It is so crazy, he can't even sort it out. They were angry. They were shouting maybe even, contrary things to each other. Who knows? Some were not even sure why they were there. The Greek word translated uproar means a raising of voices that contributes to a lack of understanding. Noise or clamor. So, all right, we're going to have to get them out of this fracas. We're going to have to get them out of this riot. So he ordered him to be brought into the barracks. We got to sort it out in a quieter area. The commander can't figure out what's going on. Verse 35, when he got to the stairs, he was carried by the soldiers because of the violence of the mob. Here they're really trying to grab at him or whatever. So the soldiers grab him and physically begin to carry him at the stairs. And then notice B here, verses 37 and 38, the apostles' interaction with the Romans. So Paul spoke to the commander in Greek, and he requested permission to say something, and so surprised him. In the very next verse, we see that by this time the commander assumed that he was an Egyptian insurrectionist. I guess, he was very familiar with this. There was an Egyptian insurrectionist who had not yet been captured by the Romans. And the commander's figuring this is probably the guy. He's the insurrectionist. That's why they're so upset. That's why there's a riot. But apparently the Egyptian rebel could not speak Greek. So when Paul speaks Greek to him, it's like, whoa, who is this guy? This can't be the same guy. See verses 39 and 40, the apostles' request to speak to the crowd. Let's look at verses 39 and 40. This is our final two here to introduce tonight. But Paul said, I am a Jew of Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no insignificant city, and I beg you, allow me to speak to the people. When he had given him permission, Paul standing on the stairs, now he's on the stairs of the fort of Antonia, so he's up a little ways so people can hear him, the men can hear him, motioned to the people with his hand, okay? And when there was a great hush, he spoke to them in the Hebrew dialect, saying, and tonight we're going to look at what he said. But notice, first of all, in verse 39, I'm a Jew of Tarsus in Cilicia. This is how he knew Greek, okay? He was a citizen of Tarsus. It was an important city. It had a good reputation, particularly in the area of education. And so he says, I beg you, allow me to speak to the people. Brave request on the part of the apostle. In the middle of a riot, I want to speak to him. Well, I guess what has he got to lose? He allows Paul to speak. And again, the text says in verse 40, he spoke in the Hebrew dialect. And I think this clearly indicates the Aramaic language. It might have been Aromatic if he had a lot of garlic. It's the Aramaic language. Fruchtenbaum believes he actually spoke in Hebrew. I don't think so. Aramaic language was considered a Hebrew dialect that they would speak. So I think he's clearly talking about Aramaic here. Now we see this afternoon what Paul says to the crowd. And first of all, we notice verses 1 through 5, Paul's Jewish background and former life. So now he's going to explain to this crowd who he is. They don't seem to understand exactly who Paul is, what his background was. And what he's seeking to do here is to establish common ground with these people. He's not some, weird cultist. He's not some guy that would go about and, violate the law by bringing a Gentile into the temple. He wouldn't do that. So he's trying to explain to them his background. He is a Jew, okay? He explains to them his former life because, as Paul always does, he's going to share his testimony with them. Isn't that amazing? Even in this, Paul is thinking about the gospel. Even in this, Paul is thinking of sharing the gospel with other people. Let me ask you a question. Are you always thinking about that? Paul was. Are you always looking for opportunities and open doors to share the gospel? How about just inviting someone to church? Even just that. One of the things I keep hearing about, I think it's Gen Xers. I keep hearing about they just want to be invited to church. By the way, I do. People don't come, but part of it may be Connecticut, New England, I don't know. But they say, we just want to be invited, and we come if you invite us. Well, nothing wrong with inviting people, and I agree with that. I think we ought to be doing that. I'm not sure it's always going to work magically by just inviting someone, but the Holy Spirit does work through us, and he can work in people's hearts. And for sure, if we could give a testimony of Christ to others, what a wonderful thing. Well, Paul was always thinking about giving a testimony to other people, even in the middle of a riot. Let me ask you a question. Had you been the Apostle Paul in the middle of this riot, would you be thinking about turning around? The soldiers have grabbed you. They have begun going up the stairs. You're at the stairs. You want to turn around and address the crowd. Would you do that? I mean, they could come at any moment, grab you, and rip you apart. Is it so difficult for us just to share the gospel with someone who might say something negative? Probably not. We're probably not going to start a riot and be ripped apart. Now, there may be someday we'll do that. Okay? Our society is becoming so anti-God and so anti-Christian, there may be a day when that will happen. But, as of right now, we still do have some freedom of speech. And the fact is, we need to use that. So we see now Paul relating his former life to them. First of all, in verse 1, brethren and fathers, hear my defense, which I now offer you. And notice he begins with brethren and fathers. The Greek here literally says men, brothers, and fathers. I think, first of all, he begins with an